And the point of accommodations in a school environment, as you say, in a home environment, is to allow them to be successful as they can and as they build the skill to increase and reduce the need for accommodation, and then to recognize when they need it or when they don't.
You're listening to Parenting with Impact, the podcast for parents like you, raising complex kids to become capable, independent adults, even in this complicated world. Each episode brings expert insights and real-life strategies to help you parent with confidence, calm, and clarity. Here are your hosts, Elaine and Diane.
Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. And it is officially time to talk about executive function because it is fall, and that is when the need elevates, right?
Well, and a couple of episodes ago, we were talking about school, and we talked a little bit about executive function in school, but part of what I think stimulated this is the death of one of our famous teachers, and the person that we've always taught the model of executive function from, Dr. Tom Brown.
Yeah. Of blessed memory, as we say. He was a beautiful mentor and friend, and he did a lot of research. He was a psychologist, not an MD, and he did a lot of research on executive function. He was actually the first person I heard speak about the topic back in like 2005 or 2006. He was in Atlanta for something. And his book had just come out, the one with the goldfish on the front.
Yes.
First time anybody ever released real research, like data-based research, that was blended with stories. And he had this amazing ability to tell the story of the research instead of just dumbing it down or numbing us down with numbers.
Yeah. Well, and it's this sort of creating a picture of the challenge of executive function instead of it just being this thing. And I think about one of the challenges of executive function is it is complicated and it does impact every aspect of our lives, which I think we'll talk a little bit more about. But parents all the time will say to me, it's like, is this their executive function? Is this their ADHD, or is this something else? And just understanding how complicated executive function is. Complicated is not the right word because it's really not complicated, but it's like it covers everything. It impacts everything we think, everything we feel, and everything we do, which literally, our level of executive function impacts everything that has to do with our being. And so when parents say, well, yes, I get my kid has an executive function delay, but is that impacting this? Absolutely. The answer is no matter what you're asking me about, their executive function delays are going to impact that in some way. Now, it may not be the most evident. It may not be the, consistent across all the executive functions. But how do we enter into this conversation? Because we could make it really deeper.
I want to finish with what you were just saying because I was actually just looking up one of the articles he wrote about this today in Attention magazine, again, back in like 2006, or it was a long time ago. And the article started with a quote, "Attention is an incredibly complex, multifaceted function of the mind." And so what he did in his research was he made the link between attention and executive function. And then he described executive function as he identified the 6 areas of executive function that are most impacted in ADHD. And he referred to it as the syndrome, right? So the 6 aspects of a complex syndrome was how he looked at it. So he was really intentional about his language. He was really conscious about not judging it and not making it look broken, but to see it for what it was objectively. And so he was really the first person that attached executive function to attention deficit and did it through the lens of how people experienced it instead of what was broken or what was the deficit. Right?
Well, and as you say that, what's coming up for me is that, we think about it in today's day and age. I think that people have a mixed relationship with even the diagnosis, the terminology of ADHD. And because of the word deficit, frankly. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people have really hard time with that language. And identifying ADHD as a diagnosis of executive function challenge. I mean, all parents can easily say, yes, my kid has challenges in executive function. They might
Right.
not be as ready to say my kid has ADHD, ASD, anxiety. And I think, Elaine, I don't remember where you learned this from, but I remember you teaching me that there are over like 100 diagnoses that
Sherry,
actually impact Sherry, was from Sherry Pruitt.
Sherry Pruitt, who wrote Teaching the Tiger.
Right.
Um,
It's so there's more than but this, and that was what, 20 years ago when she wrote
or
Taming the Tiger. So there are so many diagnoses that impact executive function. And we know that stress impacts executive function, trauma impacts executive function. You know, bad, bad weather might impact executive function depending on how you respond to the bad weather. But it's all of
menopause.
these. So menopause definitely impacts executive function. So all of these things are impacting the executive function challenges. It impacts everything we think, everything we do, everything we feel. And so it's really important to understand not so much the specifics of of executive function, but generally just how important it is to getting things
Pervasive.
done. How
Right.
pervasive. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And so when we look to, if we sort of begin to move this to, so I want to say one more thing in the way of history.
Yeah.
When you first started working together in 2011, the very first book we ever wrote, the first ebook was called What the Heck is Executive Function and Why Should You Care?
Right.
Because we had spent so much time trying to figure it out and understand it. And I think especially in those days, there was a way in which the professionals would kind of throw the term around so that the parents would feel less than, feel like, well, I'm supposed to know this and I don't know what it is and they haven't explained it. And there was this way that it was dismissive of parents. And I think that that shifted in the last 20 years, that and I think we've really demystified it so that now it is part of what it takes for people to do anything. And in kids with challenges of executive function that are delayed, that means we've got to support them differently. We've either got to remediate it and help them learn something they haven't yet been ready to learn, or we have to accommodate it and create a workaround so that it doesn't become an obstacle to them learning or demonstrating their ability to learn. Right?
So let's back up and bottom line. So executive function impacts everything we think, do, or
Everything.
they think, do or feel. And the language I like to use, and I'm trying to explain it at the simplest level, is it executive function is about self-management. Whether I'm trying to manage myself through a process, whether I'm trying to manage my emotions, whether I'm trying to manage to keep my seat, stay in my seat. There's so many different flavors of it, but it's largely about self-management. The other piece that I want to put in here is, because you were talking about delays, the research shows that kids, particularly kids with ADHD, are often, the research says 30% behind their peers in some areas of executive function. So it doesn't say across the board, all areas of executive function, but if you've got a child with ADHD particularly, they're going to be 30%, which if you've got an elementary, middle school age kid is going to be 3 to 5 years. We teach the 3 to 5 challenge. If you've got a 30-year-old, it could be more like 10 years behind their peers. And this plays out a lot. I've been, talking to a parent of a 30-year-old the other day, and they're on track with their executive function about what kids without delays hit in the age 2021 timeframe, right? So
Right.
so we know that there are delays. We know that it's not everything, and we know that it's not consistent necessarily across kids. And we know how important it is. And what you just brought into this is, what do you do about it? And there are two things you can do about it. One is you can,
On a macro level.
on a macro level, right? You can teach the skill, right? That would be remediate, or you can accommodate the skill. And we often will accommodate the skill because sometimes our kids are not ready yet to learn the skill. And I know, or what?
Or that may not, like, so I accommodate my working memory all the time because it doesn't matter how much I try, it's not going to change the fact that I need to externalize my working memory because memory is a challenge area. And it's not that I'm immature in that area. It's that I really have struggles with that area that aren't going to really change. So I have to navigate that.
And I think that that's important to share because I think a lot of times parents are like, okay, my kids have delays in executive function. Let's catch them up and they'll be fine and life will be good. And what you're describing is that some challenges of executive function will be in place throughout individual's lifetime.
Here's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. So let's talk about this and then we'll do a break and come back. Here's the other thing we learned early on that both of us went, oh, and that was that medication for ADHD doesn't significantly address executive function. It's not going to
medicate
organize a backpack. You don't medicate executive function. You can improve attention, which makes it easier to use your executive function or to organize or to whatever, but you still have to learn the skills to do that. It's not going to automatically mean that the kid is showing up on time and getting their backpack together for school and all that stuff. The medicine rounds the corners and reduces the symptoms, but it doesn't directly tackle most areas of executive function.
What it is that pills don't teach skills.
Pills don't teach skills.
The quote. Right? So we can't medicate executive function. Sometimes we accommodate it. Sometimes we teach the skills if our kids are ready to learn the skills. And the classic example of that is, a lot of times we were talking about planners. Was that in the last episode we did together? We were talking about planners in schools, and it's just sort of everybody in third grade gets a planner. And it's that reminder that your kid may not have the executive function it takes to navigate a planner when they're in third grade. They may be ready by the time, maybe not. They may be ready about fifth or sixth grade. And so there might be an opportunity to help them to begin to learn how to use those tools later, but they may not be ready and available when the school is teaching everybody to use the executive function.
And it may be that it turns out to not be a tool that's good for them at all, and that may need to be accommodated differently. Okay, so let's take a quick break.
Do you recognize current ADHD interventions fall short? At DIG Coaching, we have developed a new field of engineering and a new ADHD intervention called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. To learn more, go to digcoaching.com/impact.
Welcome back, everybody. We are talking executive function. We've been kind of remembering our friend and mentor, Dr. Thomas E. Brown, who founded the 6 aspects of a complex syndrome, the area of the way that we look at executive function in our coaching model. And it really, that piece in our model is fundamental to what makes it a neuro-informed approach, is that we took a classic coaching model, we blended Dr. Brown's understanding of executive function and some other areas of knowledge around neurodiversity. And that's what allowed our work to be really so neuro-informed. What were you going to say?
And I think that what's important about that to me is that so many of us are dealing with our kids' challenges, right? So my kid has a challenge with this. My kid has a challenge with that. My kid won't hang up their towel. My kid's not doing their homework. My kid's whatever. My kid won't get a job. Whatever that thing is, the challenging behavior. And part of what we do in our model is to say what's really going on underneath that. Right? What's the real problem we're trying to solve? And most often what we're really trying to solve is a challenge of executive function. So my kid's not doing their homework because they have a hard time avoiding distractions. My kid's not doing their homework because they have a hard time with time management and it's taking them 3 hours to do something that should only take 20 minutes. There's this executive function thing underneath it, which honestly makes it easier to deal with the challenge. So instead of saying, okay, I'm trying to get out the door on time, I'm trying to help my kid navigate avoiding distractions when they're trying to get dressed, right? So it's sort of looking at what's going on from an executive function perspective helps us to see the challenge at a smaller level, which oftentimes I think parents particularly makes it easier for us to address the challenge because we're really clear on what the problem is and not the big problem. It's a more specific problem.
So let's talk a little bit about remediation and accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Can we do that?
Yeah.
So, and I was just thinking about, we're not going to go through the 6 areas of executive function here in detail because that would be its own full episode. But let's do it on a high level, right? There are 6 areas that are most impacted in our kids. What was that? Oh, she's holding up numbers. I'm
I'm
like,
holding up 6 because those of you who are
I-
listening can't see that I'm holding up 6 fingers.
6. I know it's 6. Okay, so let's see if we can get them. One is memory,
Uh-huh.
attention,
Uh-huh. Action,
action, effort,
motion,
emotion, and or what do we call, what's the one for organization called? Task.
task management.
So this is our chart that we use for this. And those are the 6 areas that most challenges tend to show up in at least one, if not multiple areas. And so, we look at Ross Green, he talks about lagging skills. Typically, we're looking at executive function skills. So remediation, we understand that term in terms of like dyslexia and reading disabilities. We teach them different techniques so that they can learn to read. When it comes to executive function, remediation means helping them see what the challenge area is and potentially learning techniques or tools or tactics to manage that in a developmentally appropriate way. Right? Do you have an example of that?
No, I think that it's interesting because if you're talking about learning that if I'm trying to capture an assignment and so the challenge is working memory, a challenge might be follow through. There might be several things, but if it's working memory, and you were talking earlier about working memory, helping a kid figure out what works for them. And think about my ex-husband who would walk around with these yellow notepads everywhere. He probably had 5 or 6 of them in different places, which is a whole other challenge. But Elaine's going to show us her notepads, right? It's just sort of, but helping a child come up with a strategy that works for them to capture things, whether it's on their phone or on a notepad or in a planner or wherever else, would be a way of remediating because they understand the challenge and are learning a skill to support the challenge.
Here's an example in a classroom. Sometimes there's in an IEP or a 504, you'll have an accommodation where a teacher is supposed to tap a kid on the shoulder to get their attention. That would be a way of accommodating it, not remediating it. But if the kid has a system that they use on their own to bring their attention back.
Like the buzzing watch, that was like a thing with one of your kids that they had a watch that buzzed every 15 minutes to say, "What are you working on? What are you working on?"
How you
That would
doing?
make me crazy. But
So that was her way of understanding it and learning to manage it, right?
well, and technically they're
Emotional regulation techniques to calm themselves down. That's a way of learning to manage the challenge with the executive function.
well, and I think that that's the distinction is remediation. There's this fine line between what's an accommodation. If I'm accommodating it myself, like you said, is it a remediation? There are times that kids are ready to learn a skill. And so it could be a skill of organizing. So like, okay, so I'm going to figure out a filing system that works for me.
Or I'm going to learn how to sequence or plan or prioritize. Those are ways that we might remediate.
Yeah.
So accommodation happens when we're accepting that there is a gap in skill capacity for that time, and we want to work around it to help set them up for the greatest amount of success, right? We want to make sure that they can learn and demonstrate their capacity to learn.
Well, and how often do our kids have accommodations at school? I mean, most of you who are listening, and statistically, the majority of you will have kids with 504s or IEPs at school. But the piece I always remind parents is this sort of, we need to have accommodations at home, and we need to be conscious and say, where am I accommodating? What are my homework accommodations? What are not that the school is giving, but what am I doing to support my child, or what is my child doing to accommodate their own challenges in the home environment, and not just the IEP and the 504 is enough, because challenges of executive function don't just exist at school. They exist everywhere in their life.
So here's what's jumping at me as I'm listening to us, right? Is, when we talk about the challenge with managing all of these issues, is that we want to understand the issue so that it's an explanation that we can work with and not make it an excuse.
Mhm.
Parents always come to us and they say, well, I don't want them to use their ADHD as an excuse. I don't want them to use their autism or their anxiety as an excuse. And I think that's where the upset about accommodations can rise up, because people get worried, well, if we accommodate it, then we're giving them an excuse, right? And the truth is that sometimes when somebody breaks a leg and you give them a crutch, they can give them crutches. They use crutches for a while because they need the crutches until they're able to get to a point where they can put weight on it again and walk again. And the point of accommodations in a school environment, or as you say, in a home environment, is to allow them to be successful as they can and as they build the skill to increase and reduce the need for accommodation, and then to recognize when they need it or when they don't. I'm not going to remember everything I have to do if I don't use a calendar. And a calendar is a way of externalizing my memory, right?
Well, and if you think about that, so I was looking at your glasses. I'm wearing glasses today too. It's just sort of, we would never, suggest that we don't give our kids glasses because we are accommodating challenges of sight with glasses. And using a calendar is an accommodation for keeping track and remembering things.
Mm-hmm.
And our kids may not be able to self-navigate a calendar by themselves right away. Eventually, we might get them to the place where they can do it on their own and manage a calendar or a reminder system, and we want to eventually get them to the place where they are self-accommodating, which is technically,
Right.
it's a sort of self-accommodating. And so we're not giving them an excuse. We're helping them develop a set of tools. We're acknowledging that they need support, and we're helping them to become as independent in using those supports as they can be over time.
I got an example. Okay. Parents come to us a lot and say, my kid's emotionally dysregulated and I feel like a punching bag, right? It's not okay for you to feel like a punching bag, and your kid may need some support and accommodations to manage their emotional reactivity until they've been able to manage it. But that doesn't make it an excuse for it to be directed at you, right? And so that doesn't make it okay. We don't have to just say, well, I have to be a punching bag for the next 5 years because they're emotionally dysregulated. No, that means we help them learn how to manage what they can and how to direct it in a way that's safe and healthy for their relationships until they're able to regulate it better and better over time.
And even with that example, it takes time. I mean, it's like I was working with a mom, and it was, she had to be in the thick skin for a while she was focused on, okay, so he's losing his cool, he's yelling at me, he's calling me names. Okay, let's be okay there for a while, because we're over here trying to help our kids learn the skills, develop the accommodations, and how do I help the family system move everything forward instead of just being like, this isn't okay, you have to change. Because it's
Right.
really clear that if they don't have the skills to manage their emotions, just saying, you have to stop yelling at me is not a realistic expectation in most instances.
No, but if we could break it apart and say, understand that you're yelling, that you're dysregulated, that there's this emotional intensity, and let's help you direct it in a way that's not damaging to you or to your relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So this is a really deep topic. I think that
wide.
the bottom line for me in this is recognizing how pervasive executive function is. Two, knowing that if you have a kid who has executive function challenges, it's not just about, okay, let's teach them the skills and we'll get them caught up. It's about consciously saying, am I accommodating or am I remediating? And over time, setting our kids up, both at home and at school, to be able to handle as independently as possible the challenges that are impacted by their executive function. How's that for a bottom line?
That was excellent. Well done. So to those of you listening, take a minute. Check in with yourself. What are you aware of from this conversation? What did it bring up for you? What insights do you have? What ahas? What are you thinking about differently than maybe you were a half hour ago?
And as always, thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. At the end of the day, you really do make a difference.
Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.